for those who are going to be watching this on either the stream or the video, I'm here with Dr. Siva Vaidhyanathan.
Almost. Vaidhyanathan.
Vaidhyanathan.
Good enough.
Siva Vaidhyanathan, who is the author of this book. It is called Anti-Social Media, How Facebook Disconnects Us and Undermines Democracy. So this will be out on a podcast in a couple of weeks, but I think why don't we go ahead and roll right into it?
Great.
My guest today is Dr. Siva Vaidhyanathan.
Yeah.
All right. My guest today is Dr. Siva Vaidhyanathan, professor of media studies at the University of Virginia. His latest book is Anti-Social Media, How Facebook Disconnects Us and Undermines Democracy, published by Oxford University Press. Dr. Vaidhyanathan, thanks so much for taking the time out, and welcome to the Social Media and Politics podcast.
It's my pleasure. It's really great to be here in beautiful Copenhagen.
Yeah, and happy to welcome you. So throughout the book, you paint quite a critical picture of social media, and Facebook in particular, by pointing out a number of areas where Facebook affects our lives, whether that's our pleasure, our attention, and even our politics. And your critique is really unrelenting, I think, from cover to cover. And so my first question is, why did you decide to write the book now, at this point in time? Because you mentioned you're a longtime social media adopter, going back to Friendster.
Right.
And I was wondering if there's anything in particular that kind of triggered you to come out with this critique.
Yeah. My country selected a president who didn't win the popular vote, and we were all trying to figure out why that happened. Right. And so I decided to write the book a couple of weeks after the election. It was November 2016. I had a friend visiting me who had been a magazine editor for many years, very politically active and astute, and had edited some of the, biggest, boldest stories of our last couple decades. And he was in the same funk that so many of us were in, just trying to figure out what the heck just happened, how a person could lose an election by 3 million votes and become president, how a person could seemingly not run a campaign, and yet still, come close to winning the popular vote and actually, win the electoral vote. It seemed to completely throw out so many of our trusted assumptions watching politics for 40 years. So, as we were talking, I started talking about how well the Trump campaign used Facebook, that they were quite explicit about the fact that Facebook was their primary advertising platform. They were not interested in television. They were not interested in radio. And American political coverage is all about television spending. Like who's up in, what state, right? In October, Hillary Clinton started buying ads in Arizona. So like that was the big story. Hillary Clinton spreads the map, is up on the air in Arizona. And she wasn't up on the air in Michigan because she thought Michigan was a lock. Nonetheless, we weren't able to see what was going on Facebook, right? Political reporters with their standard toolkit and their standard lenses were not watching Facebook, nor could they. I mean, the fact is Trump was buying ad after ad after ad, highly targeted, very specialized, doing A/B testing on small groups of voters. He was doing it in a handful of states. I mean, no one there thought, no one in the Trump campaign thought they were going to win, but they figured if we could win, that we're only going to be able to do it because we were able to move small packets of voters either from the Hillary Clinton column into non-voters or move some non-voters into the Trump column, the voting column. And to do that, they had to, very precisely hit voters' interests or obsessions or obligations or prejudices. And Facebook is perfect for that. You can target an ad in a group as small as 20 people. You can use all sorts of profiling techniques that Facebook gives campaigns, straight up. Like you could actually do these check boxes on all sorts of attributes, from ethnicity to interest in knitting to education level to, to geography, in ways that, every advertiser obviously relishes, which is why Facebook makes so much money in advertising, right? So Trump's people were not political people. They were not political veterans, political campaign people. He had web marketers. He had people who were experts at putting ads up on Facebook. And that's exactly what they did. So I was explaining all this to my friend and saying, this is how you move between 1,000 and 70,000 votes in Michigan, between 1,000 and 70,000 votes in Wisconsin or Pennsylvania, which is all it really took. A total of 80,000 votes across those 3 states put Donald Trump in the White House, and is, destroying NATO and, causing all of this other trouble in the world that's so crazy. That's all it took. I mean, that's what's so insane about the system. Florida, which could have decided the election, went to Trump by 110,000 votes. So you can imagine that having that sort of precision is really powerful when a state is that close, right? So explaining all this, my friend said, you really need to write this book. And the fact is, I had been gathering studies and perspectives and information for a number of years, largely because I teach classes on privacy and other classes on intellectual property and other classes on digital media in general. And so, whenever an important issue would come up, I would create a file and pour all of these studies and articles into them. So I essentially had in my hard drive, in my Evernote file, if anyone uses Evernote, it's like that's my basic go-to tool these days. I had all these Evernote files that essentially worked out to be chapters of this book. It's like, and so, when I decided to write the proposal, it was, hey, I can explain a whole lot of what just happened, but I want to go beyond that. Because by the time the book comes out, the Donald Trump victory will have been heavily analyzed, and I can't necessarily add that much more to it. But if I can connect how Facebook works to the rise of Rodrigo Duterte in the Philippines, if I can connect it to Narendra Modi in India, if I can talk about how it's being used and abused in places like Kazakhstan, in places like Ukraine, in places like Estonia, we could get somewhere. And I thought, I want to write the global story. I want to talk about how Facebook, in its core attributes, is the problem, and how, contrary to the message we had been telling ourselves since 2011, it's actually working to undermine democracy rather than promote it.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the parts that I really enjoyed about the book, was this really global focus. And I want to pick up on that a bit later. But I want to kind of go a bit before Facebook. And you don't necessarily make the argument that all digitally mediated communication is bad for democracy, because in particular, you highlight the blogging era in the sort of early mid-2000s as
the golden age.
Yeah, as a time that should be looked back with quote unquote nostalgic reverence. So can you describe why that era of political blogging differs from the types of political expression we see today on Facebook and other platforms?
Yeah, I mean, we should hesitate before we declare anything a golden age, even though I just sort of did tongue in cheek. Look, most media systems around the world for about 100 years were highly concentrated and offered limited voices, limited perspectives. Very few people could say what they thought about the world through our standard television and radio channels and printed newspaper channels. So once we hit the mid-90s, or a little bit later in much of the world, we're suddenly able to publish. Almost anybody can publish at minimal cost, at basically zero marginal cost. And that is tremendous. That means by the early 2000s, once there's easy-to-use content management systems like WordPress, like Blogger, anybody can put forth a fairly professional-looking textual document, and that not only allowed people to, with diverse voices, to express themselves around the world, it allowed other people to link to those, right? So you get these webs of links, what we used to call blog rolls. So if you go to a blog that interests you, you can see instantly on the right-hand column 8 or 9 or 20 other blogs that might also interest you. You can explore those. It creates a lattice of reference and understanding. People had a habit, at least in the political world, a political commentary world, of linking to blogs with whom they disagreed, and there would be interesting dialogues among them. There would be group blogs. You would have a libertarian group blog and a center-left group blog, and they would have it out over certain issues, right? And they would write essays and link to each other, and it was a nice model. It didn't change the world, but it was a nice model for how a more open platform can allow for diversity of voices. And because your influence, your popularity was in many ways still dependent on the friction of a community of engaged and often knowledgeable people. It meant that the nutcases still had limited audience. They were able to find an audience with more ease than they were before the internet, right? But if you were a crank, chances are the big voices in the blogosphere were not going to link to you more than a couple times. They weren't going to waste their time just making fun of you, right? What changes with social media, at least by about 2010, as the news feed gets really mature in Facebook and Twitter by 2014 starts getting more algorithmic, is you get the big change, which is algorithmic amplification. So at that point, any source of content or any content itself that seems to generate interest, and that interest can be indignation as well as appreciation, that amplifies the presence and reach of that content, almost exponentially. And that is a big change. That could not happen the same way. It was human beings making individual decisions in the blogosphere. Once you have algorithms measuring responses that are as simple as a thumbs up or a click or a like or comment and quantifying that, that's a totally different game. So it was the shift to the quantification. Also, as soon as Twitter comes up, I mean, I used to run 2 different blogs, and I'm not the only one who gave up blogging once Twitter showed up, because I realized, like, who has the time, right, to maintain, like, maintaining blogs is an incredible obligation. It took hours per week, and I couldn't bore or annoy my readership with 140 to 280 characters. Like, if I was going to write something and they were going to click on my page, they wanted a few hundred words. And so, once I realized that Twitter liberated me from having to actually think deeply and write deeply about things, I took it, and many people did too, right? So the blogosphere emptied out. All of the mid-level, like the mid-list blogs like my own, basically receded, and we started building Twitter followings. I don't think that was healthy in the least overall. So in many ways, Twitter hurt the blogosphere, but also the blogosphere was just a much richer framework for deliberation.
Right, with Twitter even being called in the early days of these platforms a microblog, kind of phased out over time,
right,
even though the character limit has been increased, right? Which is kind of interesting.
I guess we could call blogs the macro Twitters.
Yes. And so kind of moving from Twitter, which is definitely not the platform that's singled out most in the book, which is definitely Facebook. And I mean, you talk about, tons of different platforms, Google, Microsoft, and we'll get to that platformization of the internet later. But of the 5 largest digital tech companies, you really label Facebook as the most dangerous. And so I wanted to ask, why is that? What is it about Facebook that makes it so dangerous?
Yeah, 2.2 billion people. I mean, that's the simple answer, right? So scale, this is important. When people think about social media platforms, you really have to keep scale in mind. So let's talk about the top 7 social media platforms in the world. 2 of them exist largely, if not exclusively, in the People's Republic of China, right? So including WeChat, which is the largest in China, has something like 800 million users. It's probably closer to 1 billion right now. So take out the 2 that basically operate in their own domain, right? Because they don't directly compete with Facebook or Twitter or anything like that, right? So now we're left with 5. Of those 5, going in order, Facebook, 2.2 billion people. YouTube, 1.6 billion people. And then everything else is below 1 billion. Facebook Messenger, WhatsApp, and Instagram are the next, right? Those 3 are all owned by Facebook. So Facebook owns 4 of the top 5 social media platforms that are that exist and work outside of the People's Republic of China, right? So that's pretty stunning, right? And just even that number, 2.2 billion, which that was the number in February of 2018. It could be as high as 2.4 billion by January of 2019. And the growth is strong. It seems to have leveled off in Western Europe and North America, as many things have, but it's still strong in the places in the world where babies are being born and young people are growing into adults. Indonesia and India and Pakistan and Kenya and Nigeria, places like that are thriving. Brazil, Mexico, in terms of Facebook usage and Facebook adoption. So Facebook is more global than the rest. By the way, Twitter has only 300 million users only. I mean, it sounds like a huge number in like the history of media.
Mm-hmm.
Like on any given day, BBC would love to have 300 million listeners, but 300 million people, 300 million accounts are active on Twitter. We don't actually know how many of those are human beings, right? So I often think it's a mistake to group Facebook and Twitter together as part of the same phenomenon, because Twitter's usage base is so much smaller than Facebook, and it works very differently than Facebook, and its reach is largely concentrated in North America and Western Europe. So it's not as important to as many human beings, and it does not shape our perceptions of the world the way that Facebook does.
Yeah, and I think I saw a statistic recently that estimated 3.2 billion people are on social media globally. So if you take into account Facebook's 2.2, it's about 2/3.
Right, and the rest of those are in China.
Yeah, behind the Great Firewall.
It's also important to remember that if you're on Twitter, you're probably on Facebook. The number of people who have Twitter accounts and don't have Facebook accounts is pretty small. It's pretty marginal, right? And they're probably people who just decided to quit Facebook for some reason, right? But so it's not like these are exclusive things. I mean, one of the reasons we have to pay attention, like Facebook Messenger, is one of those top 5. But of course, you're on Facebook Messenger if you're on Facebook. So for the most part, not necessarily completely, but the crossover is clear.
Yeah, and I mean, that was another interesting point you discussed in the book, is this kind of I don't know if you'd call it a paradox or interplay between being connected and being disconnected.
Yeah.
And getting a bit philosophical here, one of the kind of recurring points you make in the book is that Facebook limits society's search for truth. And if I can summarize that argument, it's basically that Facebook supports tribalism over truth. And can you unpack that argument for us?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so I mean, what Facebook really does, among many other things, is it makes it hard to think collectively. It makes it hard for us to gather groups of differing perspectives, agree on a set of facts about the world, identify a problem, and debate possible paths forward. What I just described is what Habermas thought should be happening in coffee shops all over Europe in the 15th century, and we all, that's the ideal, right? The ideal is that people with differing perspectives can at least work through their differences through the process of politics, deliberation, debate, etc. Right? That's how a public sphere is supposed to work. Facebook could not be farther from that. Now, we don't have an idealized public sphere anywhere, but Facebook pushes us farther from that ideal, and it does that largely by clustering us and rewarding our interests and our prejudices with more things that reflect our interests and prejudices. Its algorithms are designed to reinforce what we have already expressed an interest in, and the people with whom we've expressed an interest, or to whom we've expressed an interest, and the sources of content to which we've expressed an interest, right? So that narrows our field of vision over time. It's not necessarily a left-right political thing, although that's one way it can be mapped out, and it's totally possible for people to purposefully engage with people who differ from them. But those clusters are often interest-based, so they could be based on bicycling or knitting or reading, as well as any particular political persuasion. But the fact is, everything about Facebook, its advertising platform, its news feed algorithms, everything is intended to keep you hooked on Facebook. So they want to give you more of what you have clearly shown you care about, and they want to give you less of what they see as irrelevant. And how they measure relevance is the key. They measure relevance based on those clicks and likes and shares and comments.
Not to mention third-party data.
Yeah, third-party data, which they say they're using less of now, right? For years they bought third-party data, like any other marketing company, and fed it into the system to help refine it. And just in 2018, they've said they've stopped doing that. But it makes me wonder, I mean, are they scrubbing the system of the data they already bought? I mean, certainly at some point that data becomes stale, but it was such a powerful tool in setting up their advertising system and in helping newsfeed target content. we can't just pretend it doesn't exist.
Yeah, and I mean that brings me to the point of transparency, right? There's just an overall lack of transparency with these companies. And, there's been some discussion recently about, should they be regulated? Should they be regulated like utilities? With the utility company, you can very clearly see how it operates, right? You can track the flows of natural gas or, whatever. Right. But this black box, it makes this very difficult for us, even who are very interested in this, to know what's going on. Right. Apart from what Facebook says, legislators don't quite understand the technology. So there's a lot of unknowns there. But what I want to ask you next about following up on this idea of tribalism or sorting is that I thought it was really interesting how you discuss the Silicon Valley bubble and the culture of social entrepreneurship that many companies in Silicon Valley enact. And I hadn't really actively thought about this until I read the book. In particular, you discuss a lot Mark Zuckerberg's zeal for what he calls the hacker way. And, maybe while it's well-intentioned, you argue that this culture has produced a number of negative outcomes. So I was wondering if you could kind of describe that and then maybe pick up a bit on that Milton Friedman and John Mackey, if I have his name right, the CEO of Whole Foods, the debate you outlined in the book. I really enjoyed that part.
Yeah. So, we could go back to the late 1960s. A couple things to think about in the late 1960s, as streets were on fire in Paris and Mexico City, and and around the U.S. In the late 60s, we have the rise of an environmental movement and the sort of apex of the civil rights movement. And in both those cases, the activists involved saw an opportunity to put public pressure on companies. Put public pressure on companies to desegregate their labor force, especially their management force in the case of civil rights, and also put pressure on companies to try to behave in a way that would be less environmentally detrimental. This went hand in hand with efforts to create legal and regulatory frameworks for both of those goals. And so it's not like anyone at that time said we can do one without the other, and there was no hard or false choice between putting public pressure on companies and putting legislative pressure or regulatory pressure or legal pressure on companies. The issues were so urgent at that time. Now, it's also important to remember, like 1969, the Cuyahoga River catches on fire. The Cuyahoga River outside Cleveland catches on fire, and that started a debate in the United States that ultimately yielded the Environmental Protection Agency, the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, all popping up between 1970 and 1972. A very short period of time. But in that period of time, we had fervent arguments, right? Richard Nixon, a Republican, was in office, but we had fervent arguments in the United States about how to address this environmental crisis. Should we have market-based interventions? Should we have regulatory-based interventions? If we have regulatory-based interventions, what should be the scale of penalties? What should be the manner? What level of expertise? Should the EPA hire scientists, and should we trust those scientists' judgment? At no point did anyone say, I don't think that Cuyahoga River's actually on fire, right? It was entirely possible to have a rational debate in the United States over an environmental disaster because there was no time wasted on deniers, right? Now the whole world is on fire and we can't even start an argument about how to address it, right? Because we keep having to flow back. Given that context, one of the things that starts to happen in the 70s is libertarians say, you know what, we're facing these same problems. Like, we're not happy about the civil rights situation. We're not happy about discrimination. We're not happy about environmental degradation, but we need market interventions that can displace the state, because we don't want the state doing all this. So they start constructing an idea of a responsible company, of a stakeholder-based company, one that doesn't just answer to the interests of shareholders, but one that answers to a variety of constituents, neighbors, the country in general, labor forces, as well as consumers. And if you can construct that model of a company and implant that in business schools, you can create an ideology of corporate social responsibility. So that starts in the 1970s, hits its apex by the 1980s and 90s as business schools suddenly become important. They really weren't important in the United States before that. At that point, you have companies like Whole Foods, which if you're familiar with the United States, they're all over the United States. They're a natural and organic grocery chain and quite successful. They're in every city and town in America at this point.
Now owned by Amazon.
Now owned by Amazon, right? But for a long time, it was owned by this guy named John Mackey, who was kind of a proto-hippie from Austin, Texas, where I went to college. I knew of him for many years, and I shopped at the original Whole Foods when it was this tiny little garage of a store. And Mackey's idea the whole time was that his employees are not labor, they are not employees, they are partners, and that his company was devoted to trying to make the world better, trying to make farming more sustainable and environmentally responsible, and making sure workers are treated better, et cetera, right? So that meant he, of course, sold his products at a premium price so that only the wealthy could afford them, and generally only wealthy people shop there for a long time, and even still. That said, he developed this idea, or at least he put into practice this idea that he was reading from a number of different scholars about stakeholder capitalism. Milton Friedman, Nobel Prize winning economist, believed in the magic of the price system. And so he and Mackey started a big debate that ran in the pages of Reason magazine, a libertarian magazine in the United States. And they mapped out their debate where Friedman basically said, look, the price system is magical if you introduce any factors in there that sound political or don't necessarily directly benefit the consumer. You're corrupting the magic of the price system. You're bringing the dirtiness of politics into the magic of the market. And of course, Mackey said, no, there are other things more important. Now, my point of view is different from both of theirs, which is I don't want the muckiness of the market interfering on the magic of politics. So my position on this is that I'm suspicious of corporate social responsibility, largely because I think it depoliticizes us. It makes us think that perhaps we can address the problems of the world, whether it's climate change or labor problems or anything else, by how we shop and what we drive, rather than through limitations on pollution or on mileage standards on automobiles. Important regulations that can actually make a difference in the macro, and our values can be fought out and argued about in the public sphere rather than through our own individual decisions and disconnected, atomized decisions. Anyway, that's a long dissertation within the book, but what it really comes down to how it applies to Silicon Valley is that Silicon Valley came up at a time when faith in the state was waning, or had waned almost completely. Silicon Valley was founded by men who believed in themselves almost completely, and believed in their own benevolence, and believed in their own omnipotence, and through surveillance, omniscience, right? So these supermen, these godlike men who would found these companies that would disrupt the world and change everything. And Zuckerberg is among them. And he and the guys who founded Google and Elon Musk who's trying to get us to Mars after creating an electric car that goes really fast. These guys believe so deeply in their own rectitude and their own capabilities that they don't see any role for the state. They don't see any role for us as citizens to argue out what sort of environmental system we would want, or what sort of information ecosystem we would want, or what sort of limitations on data sharing we should want. Like those things, they don't think that we have a stake in. They think they should be the ones deciding that. Their engineers and their market forces should determine that. So to get away with it, to be able to get up in the morning, Zuckerberg convinces himself that he is improving the world. And he has since the beginning. And he's been very clear about this and very sincere about this. He's not in it to make money. It's easy to say that when you make that much money. But the fact is he's not motivated by money. He's motivated by this idea that by connecting people through Facebook, everybody will treat each other better. Everybody will recognize each other's mutual humanity and just be nicer and kinder to each other, thousands of years of human history notwithstanding. He truly believes that if you remove friction from communicative systems, that people will be better to each other. I think we have ample evidence to the contrary, even in the past 36 months.
Yeah. And I mean, that comes from, just as you're mentioning, the quantification of social validation, if you want to put it that way, or all of the algorithmic filtering that's going on. But I want to follow up on that and get into the idea of political campaigning and how Facebook embeds itself in campaigns. So we know that's happened. And I mean, the political ad revenue, it's big in the States, but it's a small slice of Facebook's overall revenue, right? So do you think Facebook's push to get directly involved in politics is something that stems from this sense of corporate responsibility, or something that's more profit driven? Because it kind of seems like they're at odds with each other.
Yeah, I think it has more to do with the idea that Zuckerberg's idea that Facebook should matter everywhere, that it must be present everywhere, that it should matter everywhere. And since politics matter, and advertising matters, he wants political campaigns to be able to use Facebook as effectively as possible. So to do that, he has to maintain neutrality among candidates, right? That's his position, and that's Facebook's position. So Facebook has been embedding staff in major campaigns around the world for a few years now. Our friend Daniel Kreis has documented this quite well. And, you know, in 2016, Facebook had staff in the Donald Trump campaign and in the Hillary Clinton campaign. It's pretty clear that the Donald Trump campaign worked well with the Facebook staff and listened to them quite carefully. And the Hillary Clinton campaign was a bit too arrogant for that and thought, well, we have all this huge database system inherited from Obama 2012, and all of this rich data, we will just use our own homegrown system to try to target voters and motivate them, and we see how well that worked. You know, the question though is, you know, look, in the United States, it's one thing to say we're going to work with the Democratic nominee and the Republican nominee in a normal election, right? So if the election is between a Mitt Romney and a Barack Obama, or a John McCain and a Barack Obama, or a John Kerry and George W. Bush, right? Those are standard issue Democrats and Republicans. But in 2016, and this is what baffles me, right? So that, I mean, what I gave you before was just the explanation, which I think is that they especially, everyone who works at Facebook, especially Zuckerberg, wants Facebook to matter to everyone, right? It's much more than about the money. But here's the thing. In 2016, they decided to help the Donald Trump campaign, even though on the day he announced, Donald Trump said that Mexicans were rapists, that several months later, he asked that he wanted to stop all immigration of Muslims to the United States, right? He had made it clear where he stood on basic human rights issues, on basic issues of humanity and human decency. And yet they still helped him. Now, it's not enough to say, I'm going to help both sides, right? Because you're still helping a person who wants to do harm to people. In the Philippines election in 2016, they actively helped Rodrigo Duterte, even though Duterte made it very clear that he was going to unleash vigilante justice on the streets of the Philippines, that he was an authoritarian nationalist leader who was going to basically undermine the very concept of democracy in the Philippines. In 2014, they actively helped Narendra Modi, even though Modi had overseen or turned his head away from pogroms against Muslims for years, right? He had been banned from traveling to the United States, and Human Rights Watch has documented all of Modi's problems. I don't want to quite call them crimes, right? So these are bad people, and Facebook decided to help them. So this is where the corporate social responsibility thing gets weird, right? So Zuckerberg wants Facebook to matter. He believes that if Facebook's everywhere, people will behave better. And he's willing to suspend his judgment about the Modis and Dutertes and Trumps of the world for this larger promise of influence, of Facebook's influence, because he believes so deeply in Facebook's ability to ultimately make things better, to the point where he hugged Duterte when he visited India. I mean, like, it's stunning to me. So how does he sleep at night knowing that he helped Modi when he went to India, or he hugged Modi when he went to India? How does he sleep at night when he helped Modi and Duterte and Trump? I'm not sure how that works. And he's never given me the time to ask him. But it's a different level of responsibility. It has to do with hubris, right? He has so much hubris about this. But fundamentally, he does not want people to think of Facebook as a political thing. He wants people to think of it as a neutral platform that will bizarrely engineer society, engineer global society into something called community. So he has this, very positivistic sense of engineering. And yet, when it comes to politics, he wants everyone to think of Facebook as being apolitical.
Mm-hmm. And that's one of the things that interests me is there's so many different types of, smaller communities than the larger one. You mentioned knitting and things along those lines. But one of the things I'm interested in is how you have one space, one portal, one platform where all these different things are going on. And so one of the things you discuss in the book is looking at advocacy, where particularly the ice bucket challenge, seems like forever ago,
right.
But you write that the cause that makes the catchiest, cutest, or most clever Facebook campaign generates the most financial support. And when you think about, you have the ice bucket challenge going on, you have political campaigning going on the same platform. So do you think that same type of logic applies across different types of campaigns and initiatives?
Yeah, I mean, in general, Facebook's flattening out deliberation, squeezing it of all deliberative power, right? So the ice bucket challenge is important in my story because it had nothing to do with the disease it was trying to address. It had nothing to do with ALS or Lou Gehrig's disease, which was ostensibly the cause for which it was raising money. The ice bucket challenge, many of the videos that traveled around Facebook said nothing about ALS, described nothing about how people with ALS suffer or what the prospects for research or medical intervention are. There was no discussion, debate, knowledge imparted by that. And yet it was tremendously successful because it was a clever and cute gimmick. Well, is that how we want to fund medical research? I mean, perhaps ALS was the most important medical concern of 2014. Perhaps. I doubt it was, not to minimize its awfulness and and not to minimize the importance of research on it. But why then? Why that much? Why that way? It didn't seem to make sense. I mean, we should be deciding how to apportion medical research funds through a deliberative process where informed people from the fields of medicine and science talk about the prospects for success, the overall impact on society, the number of people suffering from it, the ways that we can build knowledge on particular research methods. That makes sense. But to do it through Facebook, through an ice bucket challenge, seemed to me to be completely wrong and ultimately counterproductive to medical research overall. I mean, ever since then, every other foundation has been trying to replicate that buzz of that. Now, what happens in politics is, of course, political ads, even on television and radio, don't lack deliberative heft either, right? They're not much better. But on Facebook, you have the ability to mask where the ad comes from. You have the ability to so precisely tailor an ad that people outside that target don't see it. So imagine if I'm running for office against you, like we're running for city council or mayor.
You'd probably win.
Well, we'll see. But I happen to know that there are 500 small business owners, like shopkeepers in our town, and they're very concerned about shoplifting. I just happen to know this, or I'm guessing it at least. And I start like a week before the election running targeted Facebook ads at shopkeepers in our town saying, you know what? Michael is a shoplifter. I don't know if you knew this, but Michael's a shoplifter, right? And I just run these ads. They're ephemeral. They pop up on people's Facebook things and they go away. There's no way to tie it to me. You might never know that you're being called a shoplifter until it's way too late, but I may have moved just a few dozen of those few hundred shop owners away from voting for you, and that could give me the edge, right? So there's no point at which you can respond. There's no point at which you can even accuse me of calling you a shoplifter. There's no accountability for that ad. There's no point at which we can actually have a discussion about how to fight crime in our town, right? That doesn't happen. So what I see happening as we put more and more of our effort and time in Facebook is that everything gets flattened out into an instant sensation, into something that is attached to images, not sentences and paragraphs, that everything is meant to create a small level instantaneous emotional hit and a click. A click is a very easy reaction. And so Facebook, if you scroll through the news feed, you are more often than not feeling and not thinking, more often than not failing to hesitate, failing to think through the ramifications of your comments, of your clicks, failing even to, if you look at a post with a lot of comments, failing even to scroll to earlier comments to see if someone else has said something close to what you want to say, right? The very structure of Facebook limits our ability to argue, our ability to deliberate about important issues because of these sort of nested comments. It's a crazy system.
Yeah, I agree. And we've done some kind of pilot research looking at Brexit comments, and
Right.
by a very, very loose criteria of deliberation, we had about 8% of those that would even, actually not even deliberation, just having some sort of meaningful argument about Brexit.
Right.
So
it's great for insults.
Yeah. Which is also what we find more than deliberation, for sure. So that's looking at what campaigns are putting out, right? But there's also that kind of back end of Facebook, which is all the data collection. And so that obviously brings into questions about privacy.
Right.
And in your chapter entitled "The Surveillance Machine," you introduce the concept of the cryptopticon, which is obviously building on Foucault and Bentham's idea of the panopticon. So can you kind of outline what is the cryptopticon and how does it differ from the type of power exerted in the traditional panopticon?
Yeah, we're used to thinking about surveillance in terms of, a central power putting up visible signs of surveillance, right? The camera on the wall, the tower in the middle of the prison, the driver's license and passport office in Foucault's sense, right? That the instruments of state surveillance are obvious to us. And as Foucault argues, they discipline us. They convince us, perhaps without even articulating it, that we should conform, that the state has us in its sight all the time. Now, I don't think that that's a bad argument or a bad observation, although I would argue that perhaps its effects are not as broad or profound as Foucault and many of his followers would want to posit. I would say, though, that we are in a very different situation now, where most of the instruments of surveillance are invisible or hidden, cryptic, which is why I stuck crypt on the front of Opticon, right? It's a hidden system of surveillance. We are not supposed to know about cookies in our browsers, right? That's why they're not obvious. And that's why we needed laws like the GDPR to inform us of their constant presence and activity. We are not supposed to know about state instruments of surveillance. We're not supposed to know about the latest cameras, the pinhole cameras, the cameras attached to badges of officers at the airport. We're not supposed to know about biometric scanning instruments as we walk into football stadiums. We are not supposed to know about all of the ways that shops, actual physical shops, not just Amazon, track our behavior, track our habits, create dossiers on us. If we knew, we would think a lot about it, and we might adjust our behavior, we might object, we might ask to be treated more humanely. But at least we would be reminded of those systems. Again, this is why we need a GDPR beyond Western Europe, beyond Europe, the European Union. But what we have now is a system where we are not expected to conform. We are expected to reveal our niche interests and affiliations. Think about state security for a minute. What the United States wants in its state security system is not necessarily to get everyone to behave like loyal Americans. What it really wants is for those who are unlikely to be loyal or likely to create problems to reveal themselves, and they only reveal themselves if they have a level of comfort, if they're convinced they're not being watched. And if they do that, then the state surveillance systems can track their social networks, can track their affiliations, can start watching them more closely. It's a very different dynamic than what we imagine in a 1984 type surveillance society, or even what the Stasi was doing in East Germany. Which, by the way, I think the Stasi operated under both principles of a panopticon to try to constantly remind you you're being watched, but also a cryptopticon through which you could never be sure you were being watched, right? Because you don't know which neighbors are snitching on you, right? So the neighbors that were snitching on you, or the family members who were snitching on you, were cryptic, whereas the towers, the watchtowers everywhere were obvious. The officers on the street were obvious. So given that, I think it's much more important that we think about our system of surveillance as one through which we are not supposed to understand it or even know it exists. And therefore, as citizens, we should strive to understand it, to reveal it, to fight back against it, and to demand of it our best interests, not the best interests of Amazon or Google or Facebook or MI5.
Yeah, and that leads very well into my final two questions, which have to do with about moving forward. And so, you just advocated, for example, somehow protesting against that Cryptopticon. And, one way to do that is to delete Facebook. And there's been obviously a sort of a little movement that hasn't been too reflected in their numbers, judging by their latest quarterly report. Right. But then my question is, what about Google? And what about the push notifications to our phones and the way that apps are so ingrained in our everyday lives? In the book, you call this the operating systems of our lives.
Yeah.
So I was wondering, how do we address that? Where even if you, drop Facebook, we're so integrated with our phones and the overall platformization of the internet. Yeah. So how do you, at the level of citizens, how do you recommend moving forward?
Okay. So back in 2011, I published a book called The Googleization of Everything. So I finished that book in 2010 before the Android platform took over the world. And I regret this, right? I wish I had waited a couple of years and paid a lot more attention to Android, because Android is in many ways the most important thing Google has ever done. Maybe YouTube. And I actually didn't write enough about YouTube in that book either. Still a good book, but so here's the thing. If you look at what look at what Google and Facebook and Microsoft and Apple, and to a lesser degree Amazon, want over the next 20 years, they want to be the winner. They want to be the one company that manages all your data, whether that's data coming out of your car or your shoes or your eyeglasses or your pacemaker or your insulin pump or your refrigerator, right? Whatever is going to have data flowing through it, Facebook, Google, Amazon, Apple, Microsoft, they want to be the company managing that data. They want to be the operating system of your life. They've already worked through being the operating system of your phone and of your computer. That's done. That's locked into place. The real battle is over this flow of data in real life, right? There was no such thing as cyberspace. There was no such thing as the internet anymore. We are all nodes in a networked flow of data, and data flows through and across and in all of us at this point. And it will get deeper and thicker in years to come. So who will win that race? That is the question. And that's why each of these companies is trying to ingratiate us to it so that when we see the logo, we don't recoil in fear. It's also why they are trying to embed themselves in our lives to such a degree. Now, I mentioned WeChat before, the most important and largest social network system in China. In China, WeChat is the operating system of people's lives. Through the WeChat application, you can do all sorts of things in your daily life. Banking operations, you can reserve and check out library books, you can make medical appointments. You never have to leave WeChat. WeChat does everything Twitter does, everything Facebook does, everything Instagram does, everything Google does. It's one app. It's everything. And it still sits on a device, right? It doesn't yet sit in your eyeglasses or in a chip in your brain, although that may come soon. So if you're Mark Zuckerberg and you're sitting back and you're looking over the next 10 years and you're thinking, where's my competition coming from and where can't I do business yet? Well, you're looking at China and you're saying, well, I need to get into China before WeChat is everything. But while there's still a chance to get in before WeChat locks everything out. So he's trying that. But the other thing he's worried about is that WeChat will go global. What happens if people beyond China who are beyond the diaspora, the Chinese diaspora, start using WeChat? What if WeChat starts coming in 100 different languages the way that Facebook does? Won't people gravitate toward that? That's one of the reasons he's trying to build out Facebook Messenger with all these mini apps in there. If you open up Facebook Messenger, you might see some little banking apps or Starbucks app and so forth at the bottom, largely because they're trying to make it so that you habitually turn on Facebook Messenger as you live your life, as you navigate around. It's the attempt to become like WeChat. So that's the project for the next 5 to 10 years at Facebook and through many of these companies. It's why Amazon wants you to buy the Alexa thing to sit in your house, so there's constant surveillance in your house, and Amazon becomes the operating system of your life. It's why Apple's doing the same thing with its speaker system. It's why Microsoft has been trying to get people to put Xboxes in everyone's houses. Microsoft's probably doing the worst on this of those companies, but they're still doing all right. And I'm sure they have other strategies for the operating system of your life. So had I thought of this idea of the operating system of your life, I would have appended it as the final chapter of Googleization of everything. As a result, I had to put it in this book, which is probably more timely. But yeah, this is my one of my great concerns, is that this is what these companies are after. Do we want one company to have that much control over our lives? What are the implications of that? Even if that company is not Facebook, even if that company is Google, even if that company is Apple, what are the implications of that? What are the implications to the global economy, to advertising, to journalism, to democracy, to basic human dignity, to state surveillance? We have not even begun cataloging what the world would look like in a monopoly or duopoly situation where all of the data from our pacemakers and our automobiles go through one company. So I'd like to get people to start thinking about that. Now, here's the thing. My book ends without much of an agenda, without a menu of policy options that are powerful to address this. I hope that I conclude the book by saying I wish that Canada and the US and Mexico and Brazil would adopt a GDPR. That would be nice. We need better data protection. It's a necessary but insufficient response. I would also like to see competition regulators in Europe and antitrust regulators in the US push back at Facebook quite harshly. I don't think Facebook ever should have been allowed to buy WhatsApp or Instagram, but now that they have, I think it's worth debating whether those should be broken off, so that those pools of data are separate from Facebook data, and so that there's actual competition in the market. If people prefer Instagram, which I do as an experience, and my daughter does as well, and many people do, we should be able to use Instagram without feeding the Facebook monster, and maybe have Instagram grow into something that might compete with Facebook. That would be a little bit healthier. But again, that doesn't solve the larger problem of its effect on democracy, its inability to foster deliberation, the fact that we live through it by the billions. And I don't have a quick answer to that, because there is no quick answer to that. And I'm willing to say, even if we did those two things, we broke off WhatsApp, we broke off Instagram, we broke off Oculus Rift from Facebook, and we had a GDPR in most of the world, Facebook would still be this much of a problem, or almost this much of a problem. It would still be huge. It would still be growing. It would still be powerful. It would still be in the running to be the operating system of our lives. And we should still be worried about it. And the situation in Myanmar gets no better, even if antitrust and competition regulators crack down on Facebook, right? So given all of that, I want to say I don't know. Or I actually want to say there is no easy solution to the problems Facebook raises. And I do that, number one, because I actually believe that this monster is almost impossible to slay. But number two, I hope that I'm wrong. I hope that there are some really smart people out there who read my book and say, well, he's wrong. I think we can address Facebook, maybe through competition, maybe through technology. I doubt it, but certainly possibly through policy. And these really smart people think up these strategies that I'm incapable of thinking. And that in 5 years, when you talk to me next, I can say, oh, anti-social media, forget that book. It was totally wrong. I was wrong about everything, and they fixed all the problems, and never mind. That would be great if this book were useless in 5 years.
Well, that's how science evolves, right? And how we continue to address these challenges. But I do think that the book is a great sort of collection of really all the different spheres that Facebook and other social platforms do enter our lives, and the kind of implications of that. So I think you precipitated my last question, which is about policy responses. But I'm very much looking forward to reading the next book in 5 years, and hopefully we will be able to say that some of these outcomes were wrong. But Dr. Vaidhyanathan, thank you so much for taking the time out. This has been great.
Oh yeah, my pleasure. This is wonderful.